Awesome. Well, welcome again, everyone. My name is Ann Ot, and I am Senior Corps Senior Program Officer for Training and Knowledge Management. I'm joined today by my two lovely colleagues, Courtney Sutton and Deborah Truchon, who you will see in the chat box and in the Q&A box answering your questions. One caveat about questions, because this is a competitive process, there are a few types of questions that we will not be able to answer for you today. One, if your particular question is specific or requires a lot of context and discussion, we can't address it here today, but I do encourage you to send an email to the email on the screen, 2021 rsvp@cns.gov. The other type of question that we will not be able to answer today, because it's a competition, we cannot provide individual coaching or advice. This is a competitive process and we want to get great applications and make sure that it is fair to everyone involved. So I can't tell you what to put in your application, whether to start your program this way or that way. That is all up to you as applicants, but I can help you understand rules and requirements and tools available. It's up to you to put together the best application for this process. Two more housekeeping notes. This is the third in a series of webinars. This is probably has the least to do with the competition, the least to do with funding amounts and things like that, and the most to do with the actual program, the actual work, the kind of activity that gets all of us excited, older Americans serving their community and creating an impact in the community. As you can see, this is one of 5 webinars, and we have 2 more this week, and then we will start the cycle all over again in August. If you missed any this go around, in addition, as you've already heard, these sessions are being recorded and will be posted on the RSVP 2021 page. Okay, so now we want to hear a little bit about you. So I'm going to ask for the first poll question. Who here has received a federal grant before, including one from the Corporation for National and Community Service? Go ahead and fill that poll out and see on your screen, and we'll get a sense of your familiarity with the federal government. Give you a couple more seconds to fill this out. All right, looks like a majority of you are familiar with federal grants. Next question, please. How well do you know Senior Corps? That is the grant program of the Corporation for National and Community Service that I work for and that RSVP is a part of. Go ahead and let us know your answers to that. And I'll give you a couple more seconds. All right, it looks like we've got kind of an equal amount of people who are brand new versus current CNCS grantee. Welcome to those of you who are brand new, and welcome to those of you who are current grantees as well. Excited to have you here. All right, our next question. How would you describe the primary field of your organization? I know our organizations have different focuses. You probably consider yourself to belong to more than one of these categories, and that's okay too. Just pick the one that best describes you. Awesome. Looks like a little bit of everything, which is to be expected, but the majority I think is in community development. Cool. All right, we've got another question. How did you hear about us? Great, thank you. And then for our last question, just to get a sense, Have you attended any of our other webinars in this series? All right. Awesome. Thank you for participating in our poll. So it looks like the majority of you have. Well, welcome back for day 3. So here is our agenda for today. Before we dive into the heart of today's content, we're going to go over some basics of the competition. We will be talking about community impact, talking about leveraging volunteers to make a difference. We're going to give a little bit of a refresher to go over what the RSVP program is and how it works. And then we'll start to get practical. We're going to look at focus areas and funding priorities, 2 different things that are very important to master for your application. We're going to look at sponsors and stations, 2 key terms, and how those 2 kinds of organizations can come together for a great impact. And then we'll look at some examples of Senior Corps and in specific RSVP programming, and then end with some Q&A. We're going to answer questions related to today's content aloud, but you will see my colleagues Courtney and Deborah in the Q&A pod answering other questions as well. So let us start off with some competition basics. Applications are due 5 p.m. Eastern Time on September 1st for the RSVP competition. Although if you were in some of our earlier webinars, you'll know that we strongly encourage organizations to get their applications submitted well in advance of the deadline. And you can find all of the information and tools that you need at the competition website, nationalservice.gov/RSVP competition. The most important document you'll probably notice are the Notice of Funding Opportunity, NOFO, and that's the document that lays out all of the rules and that guides the competition. It talks about what to include in your application, the evaluation criteria, the review process, all of that good stuff. And our last webinar focused on that document. And then another very important document is Appendix A. This competition is limited geographically. The way RSVP works is a certain service area, a certain geographic service area is available at certain times, and Appendix A lists out all of those opportunities. In addition, when combined with it is a certain number of unduplicated volunteers and a maximum amount of funding that you can request. We're going to look at an example of this as we go on a little bit further. If you haven't been able to join in on our other webinars, just know that this is the document that you will look at to see what geographic service areas, what specific cities and counties are available to be served through the competition, and it's got some really important information. You can learn a little bit about some of the other tools that you will see on the competition homepage here. There are a lot of resources to help you. So what is this program that you are interested in competing for? The core defining characteristic is engaging Americans 55 and older in service. That's the core of it. Americans 55 and older engaged in service to the community. What is wonderful about this program is that it's got a lot of flexibility. The RSVP program is meant to meet community needs. It's meant to give you all out there in your communities the ability to say, I see an opportunity for older Americans to make a difference on this particular issue. And then you can mobilize however you see fit to make that difference. That includes crafting a volunteer experience that is tailored to them, that is right for them. We get asked during these trainings, how long should an RSVP volunteer serve each week? And the answer I have is I can't tell you, that's up to you based on what you think is right for your community. We also get questions like, how many stations and partners do you think I should have? And again, I can't tell you, I don't have the answer to that because it is up to you to figure out what you think is right for your community. working with your community partners, working with older Americans in your community, working with maybe a board of directors or an advisory council, locally driven, and that is really crucial. And when you take a deeper look at our competition materials, you will see a lot of information about that local presence, having that local presence. Two topics that we will discuss a lot today are at the bottom of the screen. We do require all of our RSVP grantees to use what we call national performance measures to tell us their story of service. We are a federal program. These grants are paid for by federal dollars, taxpayer dollars, and as taxpayers, you all are stakeholders, and we use the performance measures to measure the impact and report that back to the American people through your representatives in Congress and the executive branch. But not every single piece of that activity that RSVP grants do needs to be captured in that way. What do I mean by that? What we say is that you have to have a certain number of unduplicated volunteers programmed into national performance measures that is measured in a specific way for every $1,000 in federal funding that you receive. And a little bit later on in today's session, we'll do an example so you can see how it works. So don't worry if you have a question about this right now. Okay, so we've done some of our RSVP basics, and we will use a lot of that information, but I do want to pause for a second to clarify two pieces of the Notice of Funding Opportunity. So you'll see us refer to both the focus area and funding priorities. These are different things, and they are important. I'll jump to the Notice of Funding Opportunity to show you that in this key document, on the screen, you'll see some screenshots of the NOFO, the Notice of Funding Opportunity, specifically on page 1 and 2, where we say that in order to carry out Congress's intent and maximize the impact of investment in national service, CNCS has the following focus areas. It then lists them, and they are described in a little bit of depth. And then in addition, on page 3, we have this section under funding priorities. So applicants are required to address one or more of the focus areas on pages 1 and 2. CNCS will not consider applications that do not address any of the focus areas. But in addition to the focus areas, we are particularly interested in supporting applications that propose to include one or more of the priorities listed here under funding priorities. How do you make sense of these two different requests? Let's do some compare and contrast. So first, all focus areas are typically broader than funding priorities. When we look at that list, we will see something like opioid abuse as a funding priority because that is very specific. But then healthy futures is more broader. That's the focus area where the opioid abuse would live under. All RSVP projects must have some activity in at least one focus area. For funding priority, those are optional, but we are particularly interested in funding those types of activities. When it comes to performance measurement, all of the focus areas tie specifically to specific national performance measures. For example, if you pick education, you have a set of performance measures that go right hand in hand with education that you can capture all of our funding priorities in national performance measurements too, but they might cross over some lines, so you may need to be a little bit creative. You can kind of pick and choose and figure out how to navigate through the performance measures. It's not as directly one-to-one. And then you can see them on the screen right now. We often refer to capacity building. It's a key goal, and then you have our other funding, our focus areas rather. So disaster services, economic opportunities. If you look at the funding priorities list, specifically workforce development, education, specifically intergenerational programming, access to care, specifically opioid abuse, and so on and so forth. So you can see some of those relationships already discussed. In some cases, it's a one-to-one correspondence, disaster services to disaster services, veterans and military families to veteran and military family. In other cases, you will have something that is both a focus area and funding priority. In other cases, you will see that we ask to get a little bit more specific during the funding priority. So it's not just economic opportunity that's a priority, it's workforce development. So we have a little bit more specificity there. And then in other cases, you will see there's actually one focus area that has multiple funding priorities, like Healthy Futures here. And then we finally have evidence-based programming to the funding priorities, and that of course cuts through all of the focus areas. And you can have an evidence-based program, again, in pretty much any of the focus areas. It's really about the level of evidence behind an intervention, not describing the particular domain where an intervention works. It's important to have these things clearly separated in your mind, and we'll talk about them even more, in particular the focus areas, because they do tie to our performance measures, and that is how you're going to tell us your story of service. I know you're probably waiting for those examples. Don't worry, they're coming. But before we go too much further, I'm going to pause and see if we have any questions thus far. I know I saw one asking about the slides, and yes, the slides will be available with the recording. Okay, looking at what has come into the Q&A box. Oh, I'm sorry. Is this better, Olga? Okay, great. I'm sorry about that. But looking at what's coming through the Q&A box, I will actually address those later. So let's move on. A couple of terms to define for you, our last bit of groundwork, if you will, before we start looking at examples. You're going to hear me use the first two terms interchangeably, sponsor and grantee. That is what we here at Senior Corps call the organization that becomes legally responsible for the grant funds. That is different than a station, which is a community partner where RSVP volunteers serve. Now, a sponsor can also be a station. Actually, there can be some overlap in these terms. We just want to be clear on what they mean. Sponsor is an organization that receives RSVP funding and is legally responsible for stewarding grant funds. This is an example of what an RSVP program that maybe focuses on multiple issues with multiple partners might look like. So as you can see, Senior Corps makes a grant to a sponsor, which then recruits volunteers and places them at external stations, other organizations. They could also be conducting a wide variety of activities. One could be a food bank, for example. Another could be a school. But this graphic shows what external stations would look like versus this example, another model where you have Senior Corps making a grant to a sponsor that runs its own programs. They may be very focused, working only in the area of education, for example. The sponsor could then go and recruit RSVP volunteers to work on its own programs. Again, so us here at CNCS and Senior Corps, we provide the funds to the sponsoring organization, the grantee, that then becomes legally responsible for managing the grant. They go out and recruit volunteers in their community, and they place them at community stations. These are just some ways to think about how you can structure your RSVP activity. Let's dive into some examples. I wanted to share some Senior Corps stories. If you go to the Senior Corps Stories webpage, you will find lots of different stories from all of our Senior Corps programs, but a couple of RSVP volunteers to highlight. First, we've got Senior Corps volunteer Ken. Ken doesn't just enjoy leaving his comfort zone, he thrives on it. The 72-year-old Springfield, Virginia resident had no experience working with special needs children, but it was something he always wanted to do. After he joined Senior Corps, Ken found an opportunity to do just that. As an RSVP volunteer, Ken teaches children with autism how to swim. Ken recently expanded his RSVP volunteer service to help high school students become financially literate. One day it occurred to him, why couldn't the financial literacy curriculum be taught to special needs students as well? Ken worked with the teacher to adapt the curriculum so special needs students could access it too. Ken recently told new RSVP recruits, quote, "What you get back from volunteering is like 20 times more than what you are giving," end quote. He implored them to venture outside of their comfort zone. Great example. And Brandy has concurred. He is one of our RSVP volunteers. He's amazing. He really is. Another example we've got is Mr. Ray here. In 1999, he decided to spend his time working for a soldier and his family. Ray, a retired Special Forces soldier, served in Vietnam and had been volunteering at Fort Riley American Red Cross for the past 20 years, earning respect, appreciation, and recognition along the way. He was recognized with many awards and has been serving as an RSVP volunteer for 12 years, and that's not unusual. The average term of service in RSVP is 8 years. We've got a lot of those long-term volunteers. Those are some great stories, and I'm here to say they only scratch the surface of what RSVP is doing out there in the communities right now. I know we have many current grantees on the line here who are getting to reapply and recompete, and I know you all have stories just like these two in your community. And some of you who are not yet a part of the national service community probably already have some idea about what you want to achieve. And what we will do now is look at how we put these technical pieces together to create those kinds of connections, the kind of experiences for both older Americans and the community members they serve. We will do it through a fictional town called Verona. All right, welcome to Verona, everyone. What a great place to live. Well, it's a wonderful place to live, and it's a wonderful opportunity because they've got some counties up for competition this year, and we need to do a little bit of math. If you recall, at the beginning of the webinar, I said we would come back and talk about national performance measures. In particular, I said, when applying for an RSVP grant, you need to program at least one unduplicated volunteer in national performance measures for every $1,000 in federal funding that you receive. You might also remember me talking about Appendix A, the document that spells out the connection between geographic service areas and the amount of funding that you can receive and the total number of unduplicated volunteers you must have. Remember, this is a package deal. So when you look at Appendix A, you will see a list similar to this, where it has the state, a code for the opportunity number, and then 3 things as a package deal. So if you were to be applying for Montague and Capulet counties in Verona, that means that you would request the total amount of funding available to you here and need to include at least this number of unduplicated volunteers. I like to demonstrate how these are all connected. So the first thing an organization applying to serve in Montague and Capulet counties would want to do is figure out how many volunteers they need to program into national performance measures. To do that, you would divide $75,000, the total amount of funding available, by $1,000 because of our cost per volunteer threshold, $1,000 for every unduplicated volunteer. So if we were to do that, can anyone do the math really quickly? What would their total annual funding divided by 1,000 result in? You can let us know in the chat. See answers coming in, and that is correct, 75. For every $1,000 in federal program, you must have one volunteer in these national performance measure work plans. So they need to program at least 75 volunteers in these national performance measure outcome work plans. But per Appendix A, they need at least 100 unduplicated volunteers total. Now, those remaining volunteers can also be programmed into national performance measures, or they can be programmed into what we call other community priorities, which is just a big catch-all term for anything that you can measure using our standard measurements. It can really mean anything that is an allowable activity. So we don't allow anything like political activity or religious activity, but if it's an allowable activity, it can be included in other community priorities. So in order to get that minimum level total number of unduplicated volunteers, let's say they program only the amount they need in these national performance measures, there would be 25 volunteers remaining that could be put into other community priorities. That adds up to the 100 that they need per Appendix A. Let's learn a little bit more about what Verona's needs are. So we've got Verona here, again, a wonderful place to live. But like most communities, they have a couple of challenges. First, while many schools are doing well, they have a couple of schools where the number of students are reading below grade level. Second, like many communities, Verona has seen documented cases of opioid abuse increase significantly in the past 10 years. Third, Verona's mayor just launched an elder abuse task force to deal with sudden increase in reports of fraudsters targeting the elderly in the area. Finally, because of the pandemic, food banks have noticed increased need for their mobile pantries due to an increase in food insecurity. Verona has its challenges, but there are a lot of people and organizations in Verona who see it as an opportunity for older Americans to be a part of the solution, and they will apply for an RSVP grant. Let's take a look at the different ways that they could do that. So first up, we've got Verona's Department of Aging. They have lots of different connections across the community. They're really focused on serving seniors and giving seniors meaningful opportunities to serve. And because of that, they are thinking they have the community partnerships to tackle some of these issues, to place volunteers in stations with external partners, lots of external partners. So if you think back to that first model that I had shown earlier, where we had CNCS giving money to the organization, and then the organization recruited the volunteers to place at external partners. This is something similar. So if Verona's Department of Aging got a grant from CNCS, what would they do? If those funds were to come in here, they would use it to recruit volunteers, and for education, their stations are actually going to be schools and community organizations. They're going to work with reading partners that program that pair older Americans with students to help them read in schools, and they're going to be stations. They're going to partner with another station, maybe a local health agency that provides counseling support to help combat the opioid epidemic. Now, the volunteers are not going to be the counselors themselves. They are probably not going to be offering medical advice or anything like that, but they could be providing administrative support, helping referrals to other agencies, collecting or distributing information, things like that. They will join up with the organization that chairs the task force that the mayor had created, and maybe send some volunteers that way to serve as a training. And then finally, they're going to partner with a local food bank who has been providing curbside pickup of meal kits. All external partnerships, all volunteers doing meaningful work, but it plays out in different ways. That's their story, and what they're going to need to do is figure out how to tell us that story of service using our national performance measures. To do that, they are going to use a couple of tools: the performance measure instructions, Appendix B, and then the work plan development worksheets. The performance measure instructions tell you about specific performance measures available in a category of activity, and then the worksheets are just a way to experiment with what you're going to do before you put it into our electronic grants management system, eGrants. So from the competition homepage, you can select Appendix B performance measure instructions. And let's say the Verona Department of Aging wanted to find out what performance measures they should use for combating opioid abuse. We've got tables, and the tables summarize more detailed information that occurs later in the document, and they specify output and outcome pairs for different types of activities. So if they were interested in the opioid prevention program, that is probably going to be in Healthy Futures, one of those focus areas. And you can see it listed as an activity for many different pairs. So looking specifically, perhaps they will want to look at these pairings. We've got H4A, number of individuals served, and it looks like maybe H17 might be a good one, a number of individuals with increased health knowledge. I'm speculating what activities might be there. Maybe they are helping to distribute or share information. Maybe they want to choose this outcome. H18, number of individuals reporting a change in behavior or intent. You will have to choose an output and an outcome pairing to best match the activities that you want your volunteers to do. So now these are just some tables, and if you go down later in the document, it talks about each of those measures and provides a little bit more of a definition. The work plan development worksheets contain more information than is here, but this is a pretty good summary of some of the important information that you will have to choose. So you identify a focus area for each of the activities. The Verona Department of Aging here had to choose an output and an outcome. It's not on here, but they will also have to choose targets for those outputs and outcomes, the number of individuals that they expect to serve, and then the number of individuals they expect to create an outcome for. And then they will have to assign unduplicated volunteers to that activity. So in this example, Verona's Department of Aging decided to assign 45 volunteers to that Reading Peers program, 15 volunteers to that opioid program, and then 10 volunteers in the economic opportunity work plan. Can anyone tell me how many volunteers they would need to assign in the Healthy Futures work plan to meet their national performance measure requirements? What is the lowest number that could go there? And y'all are quick. I see some answers coming in. 5, that is correct, to meet their national performance measure requirements. Again, the requirement says for every $1,000 in federal funding you receive, you need to program volunteers in specific kinds of work plans, and these specific sets of performance measures. Other volunteers, that remaining 25, can be placed in other community priorities, and they can be doing anything that doesn't fit in the other measures. Maybe they have a couple of volunteers who will create face masks or creating care packages for essential workers, things like that. Something that is necessary for your community needs-wise, but doesn't necessarily result in the discrete outputs and outcomes Senior Corps measures. When you submit your application, you do need to identify one primary focus area. And I think I saw this question come up in the Q&A box. So you do need to identify one primary focus area. However, it doesn't actually carry with it any mathematical requirements. So you don't have to program any specific number of volunteers in that primary focus area. It's more a system thing that you have to choose one. So maybe in this case with the Verona Department of Aging, they might choose education as it's the work plan that probably reflects their greatest impact. Let's take a look at some other examples. So we have Active Aging Verona here. What they are going to do is at first, they are going to look at having some external community partners. So in this case, they look a little bit similar to the Verona Department of Aging, But let's say they have the ability to create their own training program and run a program related to elder abuse, and they've got the support, let's say, from Mayor Juliet to do so. So they are going to be providing volunteers to both external stations, but they also have their own program and will be placing volunteers in their own station, and that is perfectly okay. Oops, I jumped ahead. So work plan wise, this might be what it looks like. The big difference here is that with Active Aging Verona, they have decided not to have any other community priorities, and that's an option. You don't need to have volunteers programmed into that catch-all category. You can program more than the minimum in performance measures, and that is okay. They are still providing the total number of unduplicated volunteers on Appendix A, and of course, still fulfilling that minimum. In fact, they are exceeding, and that is okay. Our last example is the Verona Harvest. Its name, as its name suggests, Verona Harvest is focused on food security. So maybe what they are going to do is have one work plan and one focus area. They are going to have external stations do it, but that is all they're going to do. So taking a look at their work plan, they just want to focus on food security, and they're going to program all of their volunteers that they need to meet that national performance measure requirement into that one work plan, and that is okay. There's no minimum number of focus areas above one, so you need just one focus area, and there's no maximum other than all of the other focus areas that are available. So my question to all of you then, what determines a successful application? And you can answer what you think in the chat box, making sure to send it to all panelists and attendees. What determines a successful application? Make sure to send it to all panelists and attendees. I've seen a couple: community impact, details about how you will utilize volunteers. Work plan meets at least one focus area and may also include funding priorities. Highest score, correct number of volunteers. These are some good answers. Represents community need balanced by volunteers addressing. Clearly stating your volunteers' work and how it will impact your community and achieve outcomes and collect outcomes. These are all really good. Does anyone know where you can find the answer to what determines a successful application? Kelly, that's a great transition into my next slide, following the directions in the NOFA. So the Notice of Funding Opportunity. Nicole gave us page 14. I actually have page 12 screenshot, but page 14 is good too. So we're back in the notice, specifically on page 12, where we can find the application review information and the review criteria. So we give you specific criteria that our reviewers will use to evaluate our applications. This is primarily what determines a successful application. And then we provide some more detail about what all of those mean in the NOFA, the Notice of Funding Opportunity. And as you can see, the strength of your work plans is an important part of that. Also, the way that they reflect the National Performance Measure instruction. So it's really important that you take the work that you want to do, the impact that you see, and translate it into RSVP, so to speak, translating it into those 6 focus areas. All right, so that pretty much concludes our prepared content for today. We'll take some time to answer some of the questions that came in through the Q&A pod, but before we do, I'm gonna ask that we post some links in the chat to places that you can learn more programming-wise. The first one is to senior core stories. So I shared 2 stories with you earlier, but you can read some of the other stories here. These are great because we've got impact videos where you can see programs and volunteers telling their story in their own words, and you get to see them in action. I mentioned, or I did not mention, but I will mention, national service in your state. If you go to national service in your state, you can see kind of what is happening in AmeriCorps and Senior Corps in your state. And this one is important, especially for individuals. I think I saw a question about your geographic service area not being on Appendix A. This is a good place to look to see if there are other opportunities near you. The transparency results. So we post the results of all of our competitions online at that website, and you can actually go and view successful and unsuccessful applications from the past on that site. Another great resource to get to know about RSVP and some of the programming happening across the country. But with that, I will open it up for questions and invite Courtney and Debbie on the line.
Thanks, Anne. We had a couple of questions asking about talking more about the capacity building focus areas. And so can you elaborate a little bit on how we define capacity building?
Sure thing. Let me get the NOFA so I can give you the proper definition, and then I'll expand on it a little bit. Please excuse the paper shuffling. So in the NOFA, we describe capacity building as, or a grant that would be doing something in capacity building, as a grant that would provide support for volunteers in capacity building activities. These activities are indirect services that enable CNCS supported organizations to recruit and manage community volunteers. And in Appendix B, the performance measure instructions, you'll see a couple of outcome pairings that more specifically talk about what is allowable in terms of the RSVP program.
Hey, Anne, it's Debbie. There's a couple questions related to intergenerational programming. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure. So intergenerational programming is something that you traditionally hear more so in our foster grandparent program. Essentially, we've got an older adult, someone 55 and older, paired with, or not necessarily paired, but doing activities in education with younger people. They really focus on assignments that address ways to increase older adult engagement with young people in the areas of, I don't want to misspeak, but I believe school readiness and K through 12 success. Let me look at the NOFA to make sure that I'm not saying the wrong objectives. Yes, school readiness and K through 12 success. So if you look at the performance measure instructions under education, there are a couple of objectives. Intergenerational programming would fall under some of the performance measure outcome pairings in the school readiness objective and the K through 12 success objective.
In reference to volunteers, we had a couple questions about volunteers. Do volunteers have to consistently or solely be a resident of the geographical area that a grantee is applying for?
Oops, sorry, I was on mute. So volunteers need to serve the community for which the grant is awarded for.
Can you provide any additional information or guidance on other community priorities? What is there a limit on the number or percentages of volunteers that can go into that, or how to think about putting information in that section?
Sure. So in terms of allocating volunteers, the only rule that we have is that you need to have at least one unduplicated volunteer for every $1,000 in federal funding that you receive in a work plan that results in national performance measure outcomes. The rest of the volunteers that remain can be placed however you want. So in the example with Verona, because they were receiving $75,000, but Appendix A wanted them to have 100 unduplicated volunteers, 75 of those volunteers needed to be in a work plan that resulted in national performance measures. The remaining 25 could either go in other community priorities or work plans that resulted in national performance measure outcomes. So as many as you would like, so long as you are meeting the minimum number of volunteers that needed to be in national performance measure outcomes.
Hey, Anne, there's a question about dosage. Can you talk a little bit more about the output and outcome performance measures and how dosage plays a part in that? Sorry, I'll jump in a little bit. So for the question about dosage, when you are filling in your performance measure, one of the things you'll have to put in is talking about the amount of time your volunteers might spend in doing the service. And so that is what we refer to as the dosage. That terminology is used a little bit more in our other programs than they are for RSVP because RSVP can be so, it can vary so much in terms of what a program is doing. Dosage will probably fit more depending on your proposed project. So I see Cindy in the chat box talked about reading 1 hour a week with preschoolers. So that would be an example of dosage if your program was proposing to do an education program. But in some other instances, if you were doing something with environmental stewardship maybe, or I'm sorry, I'm trying to think, or something with capacity building, there might not necessarily be a dosage. And so that is going to be very particular to the type of program you're proposing.
We also have a couple questions on entering output and outcomes for each focus area. And can you talk a little bit more about how those get developed on completing that?
Sorry, can you say that again, how they get?
Sure. How, when completing the outputs and outcomes for each focus area, are you able to choose more than one? And also for the drop-down menus, or filling that out, is that something that applicants need to fill out on their own, or is there a list that they would pull off of?
Sure. So my recommendation is that as you develop how you're going to tell us your story, that you use Appendix B, the performance measure instructions. In terms of focus areas, you must have at least one. So the minimum amount of focus areas that you need is one for CNCS to consider funding your project. You can have as many focus areas as you would like as well, but you need to have at least one. You also need to select one primary focus area. I mentioned earlier, there's no like mathematical requirement for the primary focus area. It's just something that the system requires. But again, just one focus area. And then when it comes to outputs and outcomes, you can have as many work plans as you would like. So if you have a lot of things that your organization could do in Healthy Futures, I'll go back in the slide deck to our examples in Verona. So Active Aging had 4 different work plans with it looks like 3 different focus areas versus Verona Harvest, who just had 2 work plans, really just one focus area and other community priorities. Does that help answer those questions?
I believe so. Thank you.
I saw a question about why capacity building was in red. Technically, capacity building is a goal. It falls under our focus areas, but it's not technically a focus area, but it is a focus area. I know that's confusing. It's just different, but it counts for the purposes of this grant competition. It counts as a focus area. I saw this question a couple of ways. If a grantee or if an applicant could apply to different listings on Appendix A, could you apply for multiple geographic service areas? Yes, you can apply to different geographic service areas. You need to make sure, though, that you have a separate application for each listing. Make sure to continue to add your questions to the Q&A pod. We have a couple of minutes left. We'll try our best to answer some more of these, but I also want to reiterate that we have the both the nationalservice.gov/RSVP competition webpage, and then also 2021 RSVP at cns.gov. And yes, I'm sorry about the capacity building. Your application can focus only on it.
Hey, and we had this question a couple times. In reference to the scenario of teaching swimming to children with autism, which focus area or priority would that fall under? Do we have any examples of that?
Sure. So I'm not knowing the specifics about what he did at the top of my mind. I think of Healthy Futures and then also education with intergenerational programming. But you would have to look specifically at the outputs and outcomes to kind of see where it could fit in. as well as the service activities. And I've seen a couple of questions asking about a consultant for this process. Unfortunately, from CNCS, we are not allowed to provide coaching on this process. We do have the training and technical assistance calls, as well as all of the guidance and materials that are on the website. But that is the extent of which we are allowed to provide help.
There's a couple of questions about evidence-based programming as a priority, and I just want to touch a little bit on that. So this is not specifically an evidence-based competition. If you are proposing to run a program that incorporates some sort of evidence-based programming, you are absolutely welcome to, and that's great, but it is not a specific funding priority for this competition.
I saw a question about the transparency postings. Our wonderful webinar producer, Mike, had posted a couple of links. So if you scroll up, you'll be able to see where he posted some hyperlinks. And I've seen some questions about capacity building and intergenerational program. Give me 1 second. Let's see if I can switch my screen. If you go to the performance measure instructions appendix B from the website, the first few pages, the first couple of pages, there are some questions about, or not questions, sorry, some lists that show the focus areas and then their corresponding outputs and outcomes. So capacity building is the first one, and you'll see, I believe we have 3 outputs that pair with an outcome. And then there are certain service activities. So training, system development, resource development, volunteer management, etc. And then you can see similar things for each focus area. So education, if you recall, I had mentioned that education, things that fell into school readiness and K through 12 success usually had to do with intergenerational programming. There are lists of service activities that you can choose from. So tutoring, mentoring, out of school time, family involvement, service learning, classroom teaching, etc. They're all in the performance measure instruction. So you'll be able to see those there. It's the service activities with the corresponding output and outcome pairings with the corresponding focus areas. And thank you, Mike, for posting the list again. So you can click on any of those links there to see the senior core stories, impact videos, national service in your state, and transparency posting. Courtney and Debbie, is there one last question that maybe we've seen a lot that we can answer for the good of the group?
I haven't seen any, but I would just like to remind everyone for your questions specific to competition and applications, you can always go to the nationalservice.gov/RSVP competition site to review the NOFA. That'll have a breakdown of everything that is required for the application. It'll also link you to regulations that talk about allowable cost and what is prohibited and allowed in the program. So please always go and check the notice of funding opportunity on the RSVP competition website.
Thanks, Courtney. One last question that I see that I will answer out loud because I've seen it a couple of times. Do volunteers register with RSVP in a specific way. Organizations who are awarded the grant, so those sponsors and grantees, are responsible for doing recruitment from CNCS, from Senior Corps headquarters. What we do have is this thing called the Senior Corps Pathfinder, which you can take a look at, where it has kind of different organizations and stations where if you are looking for a volunteer opportunity, who to contact, but there's no specific way. We don't mandate a specific way for volunteers to register with RSVP. Hopefully that helps. I think we've answered the majority of these. I'll echo Courtney's sentiments and just say again, we've got nationalservice.gov/RSVP competition. Thank you everyone for spending the afternoon with us here today. We're about to get thunderstorms in my neck of the woods in Northern Virginia, but I hope you guys are staying cool and staying safe and indoors. Good luck with your applications, and if we see you the rest of the week, I'll be happy to see you. So have a great afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming.